Hello and welcome to the 43rd episode of Coffee and Cocktails. I'm your host, Dr. Ann Wand. This month, for our series on giving voice to the voiceless, we will be talking with anthropologist Chiara Cocco, who will be discussing with us today about the stigmas and potential discrimination surrounding menstruation and breastfeeding in academia and the workplace. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. As per usual, we'll start off by having you tell us what drink you were having for the show, followed by a little bit about yourself. Chiara, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So, I a lot about what drink I was going to have. I ended up having chamomile tea.
Oh, nice.
And also, it's just before lunchtime.
I was going to say, doesn't that make you pee? That's the right one
just went to the toilet and came back. So hopefully I'll be fine. But yeah, so chamomile tea. I didn't feel like having my second coffee of the day just yet. So about me, what can I say? Yeah, as you said, I'm an anthropology and still completing my PhD in cultural anthropology, research in festivals, ethnography and autoethnography of festivals. But I am also a postdoctoral research associate for the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Caucus here at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, Scotland, researching menstruation in the workplace.
So random. How are you able to finish a doctorate and do a postdoc at the same time? Like, I didn't even think that was possible.
No, it is.
Obviously,
it is. It's actually not that unusual. To be, you need to be at your completing stage of your doctorate. So I've done my data collection and everything. I'm just writing it up. So I'm submitting
the easy
by
stuff,
the end of
just writing it. Just no worries.
It's been a ride. Oh my God. But because I've been working in the meanwhile, and also because I've become a mother during my PhD. Then things got a bit slowed down, as we might discuss later on. And but then I got this opportunity and I took it, and it's great to be involved in this project. I'm really enjoying my postdoc, and it's actually helping me out somehow also to kind of be even more motivated to finish my PhD as soon as.
Absolutely. Got to make that big money. That's really what it boils down to. And pay back those loans. About that. Yeah. Well, I know we had talked briefly before we did the recording, but something I think it might be worth talking about, but for listeners' purposes. One thing I'd mentioned to you is that occasionally I get pitches for ideas, and some of them are like immediate yeses. Some of them are like, ooh. And then occasionally you get one where you think, I am so out of my element, but I'd like to definitely have a chat. And yours was definitely one of those where I was like, I feel out of my element, but I definitely want to have a chat. So we had a chat, and then I realized, wait a second, why do I feel out of my element if I have menstruated?
It's your element.
Clearly, I've had 2 kids, had to breastfeed. I breastfed both of them. I've had to juggle trying to work, write a book, figure out a new career path and just a multitude of things. And then I realized, well, holy crap, I'm a poster child of what this would be. And in the readings that you sent over, of which I had no idea how vast menstruation. Firstly, I didn't even know menstruation studies was a thing. And then secondly, to find that menstruation studies is like an explosion of information, absolutely blew my mind. And in talking about this, I realized that when I tried having conversations with family members about these topics, my husband, who had some experience working at hospitals, was actually quite comfortable with it because he's dealt with bodily fluids of a different matter, if I can put it that way. But for other people in my family, they were a bit uncomfortable. And I think we should dive into that element of A, what this topic is about, and then B, why why it can be uncomfortable for people to talk about. So maybe what we could do is start off with the first question, which is what initially got you interested in studying the effects of menstruation and maternity support, or the potential lack thereof, in academia and industry?
Yeah, where to start really? Because as I said, I am doing a PhD in something that is apparently very unrelated to this. Let's say that I've always been interested in equality, diversity, and inclusion. I studied sign language both in Italy and here in Britain, and kind of looked and experienced and seen like the kind of barriers and marginalization of people, like in education, for example. Then, I decided to just study, to do a master's in cultural resource management here at Harriet Watt. And there I kind of became familiar with like gender theory, feminism, and really also try like understanding more about marginalization and inequality. And just last year, I got a job in a project led by Professor Kate Sang, who was also the PI of this current project I'm working at, and it was about disability inclusive science careers. And that's where I really delved into marginalization, barriers, challenges for disabled people, and how really understanding how the issue shifts from the actual individual to the environment that is disabling rather than the condition. And that so applies to menstruation and menstrual health in general, as well as perimenopause, breastfeeding, motherhood, and other things. And then, yes, there was this opportunity to join the caucus, the Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion caucus, which is really broadly looking at how to create accessible, inclusive, and diverse careers in the research and innovation ecosystems, so including academia, of course. And one of the work streams looks at the life cycle and how it relates to the career cycle and how these two interact. So the life events and the work events interact with each other and how they affect each other. And my work and my focus is looking at menstrual health in particular, with the aim of basically creating workplaces and careers that are accessible, where menstruators really and can thrive. Mm-hmm. And what got me interested, what's not to be interested about it, something that relates to me as well, as much as you said it, it's something that I experienced myself by being obviously a woman, a menstruator. I've been pregnant, I gave birth, I breastfed, and that all interacted with my workplace. But you don't tend to look at it that way. You never think about the correlation. And by doing the work with disability and then delving more into these interactions, then I found the link and I wanted to explore it better.
Yeah. And I think something that, has come up in the writing quite a bit, and I think you definitely tapped into it, is this big idea of disruption. One of the things that I've tried explaining to my parents, and they have a really hard time grasping this, is the fact that most of the people I know of my generation don't have children at all. Some of it is situational. I'd say most of it is because they genuinely don't want to have kids. And I think that disruption element, I'm sure there's more to it, but I do feel like that disruption element could be a potential factor, whether it's a disruption for them in terms of their career progression, or potentially a disruption to their colleagues around them. But I do think that ties into this idea that we'll tap into in terms of stigma and the effects that it might have in terms of our relationship with the work environment and vice versa.
Yeah.
So if you could, why do you think, we've talked about this idea of disruption, but are there any other reasons you can think of where there might be stigma in the workplace around menstrual health, perimenopause, and breastfeeding? and how that could potentially relate to gender inequalities at work.
Well, there is stigma in the workplace because there is stigma in society. You made the example of talking to your own family and having faced discomfort from them, which means that menstrual health is still seen as a taboo topic. It's not the kind of conversation that you would normally have with a group of people at the dinner table, because for many reasons, I suppose, because it involves bodily fluids that are not pleasant to talk about. I suppose because it's gendered, it's something that relates to women. And the interesting thing is that it does relate to women, and it makes them, in a sense, it is also a signifier of their ability and our ability to reproduce, which is very much looked up to, it's something that is very much valued. But looking into the actual condition, then that's uncomfortable. So it's something that obviously goes in contrast with that sort of like kind of ideal body that the woman also must have. Like she has to be, in a sense, fertile and reproduce and give birth, etc. But also she needs to be perfect and flawless. And
well, aren't we? Clearly.
We still are.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so there is a lot of like this stigma that is cultural. And even if you think about how, for example, menstrual products are advertised, and it's just always aimed at concealing the blood and silencing the menstruation, and that's something that needs to be obviously addressed and counteracted on.
I think that's interesting, this idea of the way it's advertised. I mean, there was an advert I saw probably within the past 6 months. I can't tell you exactly what company it was. But anyway, the point is, when you see the adverts, you'll see a maxi pad, and normally it's blue.
It's blue,
it'll say, oh, it's super absorbent. They give a little twisteroo, and look, none of this magical blue liquid comes out. And this time it was red, and I was like, bleh. And then I'm like, wait a second, that's what it's for. Like, why?
Yeah.
I mean, technically that is actually its purpose. We don't spew out blue liquid. So
yeah. And we think, how subversive is that? And it's like, I'm subversive. And it's like, it's actually, it should be blue. It should be red. It's blood. And we don't talk about it. It's not even named. Blood, especially in relation to menstruation, is just what people don't want to hear or see or talk about.
But yeah, I remembered the ad. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I still remember. So it clearly was effective advertising. Still can't remember the brand name. But the point is, I was like, whoa.
Yeah. So there was a shift. To talk about it more, to normalize more. Yeah. I think it's it could have been an Australian campaign or something, I think. But yeah. But I think I want to say something else about the stigma. Yeah, there's also like cultural and religious beliefs linked to menstruating women, and like the impurity still related to that, to the blood. In some cultures, they like menstruating women cannot enter churches, for example, or sacred places. Or if you want to shift it to like secularized environments, actually, I've heard that actually there were some labs where women couldn't access when menstruating because of temperature. Like, the reasoning behind was that like menstruating women have or menstruating people have a higher temperature that could possibly contaminate whatever material or matter they were studying. But that is proven to be like not accurate at all and completely.
Sounds like X-Men. I'm like, oh, you're period girl. Sorry, you can't come in here. This is kryptonite for you. Period girl's gonna have to stand outside.
Exactly. So, and that's like finding always kind of a justification for if you think about it, just women to be marginalized and excluded.
So it's funny. It's not funny, but it's interesting you say that. So when I was talking to my mom yesterday about this topic, and Mom, if you're listening, sorry, but I'm putting you in here. She was a bit like about the whole thing, and then we worked our way through it. I like to think we worked our way through it, because I said, well, why are you feeling a little uncomfortable about this? And then the more we talked about it, I think the more she realized, like, oh wait, like, why am I uncomfortable about this? And I think it's this internalized idea of what is air quote accepted and not accepted, what is appropriate and not appropriate for the workplace, right?
Yeah.
And she said to me, she goes, remember that book you read years ago by Anita Diamond? She's a Jewish author. She wrote a book called The Red Tent. And it is, if you haven't read the book, I highly recommend it. Mm-hmm. And it is I guess you could say a fable. It's a sort of, she took a small line out of a story in the Old Testament, and then she expanded it into this incredible novel. And the Red Tent is supposed to be the place where nomadic Jewish women would reside for 7 days while they were on their period. And it was sort of like the female headquarters where the woman would gather, they'd do each other's hair, they'd take care of the children. But this Red Tent was sort of their home. This is their place where they could reside in certain periods of the month. And throughout the course of the story, this particular woman, she talks about growing up in the tent as a child, and then eventually having children, and then eventually becoming a midwife, and the experiences of what it's like, bringing children into the world, and that demarcation element of something as simple as just tent material actually carried so much more behind it. It was a very powerful book. And I think when I read it, I was probably in my late teens, early 20s. And it made me view the cycle of life and the role of women in a very different way that I hadn't expected otherwise. So I think that this idea of gender demarcations and roles is clearly something that has just existed for a millennia, as long as we have been alive.
Yeah.
Which kind of ties into this next element, which is just so bizarre to me, why menstruation is not normally considered a public health issue within the workplace. And maybe we could dive into that a little bit more. I want to be aware of the fact that there are people who have endometriosis and polycystic ovarian syndrome, but why it's sort of a quieted element within the world of public health.
I think it's just, it really goes back to the stigma, the tabooization of menstrual health. And because it is so gendered, and here I really want to also just underline the fact that menstruation and menstrual health does just not relate to women, but it also applies to trans, non-binary people and those who were assigned female at birth but don't identify with that. And but by being so gendered, it is always something that tends to be dismissed. Even like the pain. So you said endometriosis, for example. Endometriosis, 10%, at least 10% of the people menstruate suffer from endometriosis, and it's still a condition that is mythical, like medical, like the medical personnel, like even in medicine, there have not been major breakthrough through endometriosis because it was always being dismissed as like, oh, you're making a fuss out of your pain, and hysteria related to that as well. And even right now, it's still so hard to diagnose. And also, endometriosis does not just relate to the genital area, but you can find actually in other tissues of your body. You can find it in your lungs as well.
Whoa.
So it's a condition that still needs to be explored, and it is so debilitating that, but still, we don't know enough about it. And it's because it's always been dismissed. And I argue it is because of its gendered nature.
If I could, and I like to play devil's advocate, not to start fights, but just because I'm genuinely curious. Yeah. What made you come to that conclusion?
Because of the structural inequalities at like in different levels of like society, like from families to the workplace to the broader organizations. It's always been male-centered, so we still live in a patriarchal system, so where the norm is always the kind of able male body. Therefore, what's gendered is the other. And therefore, whatever relates to that is othered and often dismissed. So obviously, like, this kind of a bit theoretical, but in practice, you can see it in like the gender pay gap, but you can see it in the glass ceiling at work, for example. And yeah, you can see it everywhere, really. And by listening to people's lived experiences, you hear how much like gender plays a role into how you are seen, you're treated in the workplace as well as in other organizations.
And yet, what I think is really interesting, and I know you and I have talked about this at length outside the podcast, is this stigmatization, this poor treatment, shall we say, of some women. Actually, the bullies are other women. Yeah. In some cases. And I think that that's really interesting as we talk about this idea of the patriarchy. But I think what I'm learning from my personal experience is that there are quite a few women who have been bullied by senior women who sort of have absorbed or maintained this sort of old school way of thinking, and they punish other women for being women. It's almost kind of like, so what? Like, what's the big deal? And I found that really interesting because on the one hand, I would assume, okay, maybe I would get that from somebody who has never been through what I went through. Okay, sometimes you just don't know unless you've been through it, okay? But for somebody of my same gender to almost be more dismissive and more disrespectful and more hurtful. And in the research that you had sent me, there were other women in forums who were basically like, sort yourselves out. I had to sort myself out. So why are you making a big fuss out of that? I mean, that blows my mind. You know, I think we would want to move past this, but there's almost like this 1950s mentality in some respects. And I'd just be curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I totally see what you're saying and understand it. And I can't say it with awareness that I experienced that myself, but through some of like some data collection that we are like going through just now, actually, this has come up. This has come up from people's lived experiences, and it is a lot of time women themselves like putting hurdles on other women because of the different experiences. So yeah, like a senior woman could say, you know, I've been through it, so you can do it, you know. And if you're not able to, then you're not enough. Or some women, right? Or you're weak, and some women haven't had menstruation, because we also need to understand that, like, menstruation, for example, is quite of a natural occurrence, and like it doesn't have to be necessarily problematic, and some women don't experience problems of any kind. They've got maybe a 3 days period.
That sounds lovely.
It's not even
That's never been my
heavy.
life.
They don't experience like painful periods or things like that, and they're fine. And they base, because of like the fact that we don't talk about it, not even among women, especially in an environment of such as the workplace that is professional, and things like that are not deemed to be professional. They're intimate. They're your thing. Like, it's your thing. And actually, in Italian, we've got the expression, I've got my things. They're all the mie cose. Mm-hmm. That means I've got my period, so it's your thing. Then you base menstruation on your own experience. So if your experience was fine, then you tend to be dismissive, on other women, and you might think, oh yeah, they're just attention seekers. So many times I read that,
Yes.
And again, with endometriosis or other,
or you're being difficult.
You're being difficult. You've got PMS. You're hysterical. Like you're irrational, because maybe that person never experienced that, and instead of actually understanding and empathizing in a sense, because there's not much knowledge, because it's not discussed, there's not education on menstrual health at any level of, like, not in school properly. Like, we're starting, and that's great to see that, but it's not enough yet. And if we're talking about people now in senior positions, which I'm sure those women have had their own struggles, and they have to fight in a very male-dominated environment. So they've had their own struggle. And because the environment is so inaccessible and is so patriarchal, then what happens is that oftentimes the women internalize that, and that's their way to thrive. Which is almost
like, it is sad, but I think there's also this idea that I had to suffer, so you're going to have to suffer. It's almost like a rite of passage.
Exactly.
Rather,
recently I've read something that was really nice, where I must put it somewhere in my notes, but it was on the lines of, like, rather than, I had to fight it so that you won't need to. And I kind of lead the path for you. I free the path from the hurdles for you. I just add more because you need to see what I've been through,
Yeah.
It's kind of a survival instinct and discourse that is very, very toxic.
Absolutely. And I think, if we talk about this idea of taboo, so Sang, who you work with, you sent me this fascinating article. She and several of her colleagues wrote a paper looking at what they call blood work. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that as well. But in the article, Sang and her colleagues state that the cultural code of menstruation has generally been one of, as you've mentioned, silence and concealment, compounded by an internalized taboo and feelings of shame and disgust. What effect do you think this has had on women in the workplace, just in terms of their daily life and day-to-day experiences?
Yeah, the effect of, like, excluding them from the workplace and career path. These are issues that are in the workplace because they were before in schools, and they were in the families, and they do reflect into the workplace. So for a person who does have, for example, heavy period and bleeds heavily and is scared to leak through because it's absolutely disgusting for people around her or around them to see them bleeding, then that person might not be choosing to do some work that, for example, takes you away from toilet facilities and things like that, like field work. for example. Fieldwork can often be so inaccessible. And I'm talking here about like the academia, for example, of, like research, innovation, careers where, personally, myself, and I'm like in the humanities, I had to be doing field work in the streets and stuff without easy access to the toilets. But I was doing it like back home in like kind of familiar environment where I could more or less deal with it quite easily. But then I've seen, like, I've read some article of like, and we're actually going to talk to them next week. I can't wait, of this group of researchers who do fieldwork in the Arctic and how they deal with menstruation in the polar field,
Yeah, I mean, it's not like you just go to the shop. You're like, hey, Mr. Seal, do you have some tampons?
Yeah, exactly. So how to deal with that? And because it's something that is not talked about in the first place, and the workplace, the field work, the environment is not designed to accommodate that. And because there is this internalized shame of it, of not talking about it, then it's a vicious cycle of like not even pursuing any sort of career, let's say, that could potentially, clash with your bodily needs. It's like basically, if you want to succeed, you don't have to have a body, or your body really needs to behave in a sort of like robotic way.
This is not totally real. Well, I don't know. This experience, talking about the Arctic, made me think about an experience I went through years ago. I wasn't in the Arctic, but I was in the Alps. And you probably know what this is like. If anybody's ever been skiing, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. So if you go skiing, you wear your entire wardrobe on your body. Like, that is just the fact of life. You've got long underwear, regular underwear, at least 2 layers of socks, thick like overalls, and a jacket and a hoodie and everything. You are the Michelin tire man. So I was skiing with my husband. I was like, I'm going to poo my pants. And it was like, I'm going to poo my pants now. And we were on a mountain and I was like, oh, this is bad. This is so bad. So I'm like trying to ski as fast as I can. And I find this hut and I was like, I'm sweating. I gotta go. So I take off my skis and I got my big boots on. I'm like, I'm gonna grab my pants. And I get to the toilet and it's just a hole. And I'm like, I can't poo in this. This was designed by a man. I cannot poop in this. And I have all of my stuff on. I was like, I gotta find another place. I told my husband, I was like, I'm gonna grab my pants. I can't poo in this because I can't poo in this because I got too much stuff on. And I found another hut that thankfully had like a regular Western toilet and I could do my thing. But the amount of stress, and I was like, leave it to a man to design this. Because he just figured like, whatever, like, I'm a dude, just, or pee. You can
just do it.
For a woman, there's a lot more that goes into this. And that wasn't even my period,
No. Yeah. I mean, and you were not even working, let's say.
No.
Like, you were not even performing a task that needed to be performed in a certain way. But yeah, exactly. And it's something that we don't really think about, even yourself. But you haven't had this experience. I'm sure you never really reflected on it when, like,
I was mad. I was like, leave it to a man to dig a hole in the ground. Like, I was just so mad.
No, exactly. And you see how, places are just designed for certain types of body. And the question you asked me before about the gender inequality, that's what I mean. Like when you see that the environment is just not designed, and it's gendered as well as this all the other marginalized and protected characteristic, like disabled people and or mothers and breastfeeding people. So you see how you're somewhere that is like where you don't fit. You feel like you don't fit, but it's actually the environment that is unfit, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So that leads to the next thing. period leave. I have never heard of period leave. Could you tell us what that is and how it has been used in the workplace?
Well, yeah, period leave is like some sort of policy that is put in place in a workplace organization that has the aim to, in a way, allow menstruating people to take a leave, and it could be paid or unpaid, but take a leave of work because they are menstruating.
Okay. And has any institute ever done this before?
So yeah, there are also like some actually at a national level. There are some countries that have implemented that as policy.
Okay.
But there is a big debate around it as well. So there's like pros or like people that are openly, and the reasoning behind actually putting them off at a national level, obviously, and then those who are openly against them. So there are two sides of that, and if you like, in principle, like here in, period leave is like, it's a protection and, it's an accommodation. That's what, like here in the UK, we talk about reasonable adjustment for something, and that might be seen as a reasonable adjustment. However, there are several drawbacks on period leave. And
what would those be, if I could ask?
So again, the reason behind it is that like this protects women or people menstruate, giving them this layer of accommodation. However, you can argue that's a gendered policy, and also you have to demonstrate that you are on your period somehow. So there's a matter of like, in some cases you need to kind of demonstrate that you're on your period. There have been issues in some very controversial workplaces where women or people were asked to just literally show that they were menstruating in order to get the leave. You have to disclose that to your manager, that sometimes is a man or a not very understanding woman, as we mentioned before.
Wow.
It could also it could be in a sense also encourage some sort of like resentment, because it feels like a gender rule where is applied to all women regardless. It also medicalizes and again problematizes menstruation, which shouldn't be that way. Like we said, in menstruation, menstrual health, and perimenopause as well, and menopause, because also there's period leave, there's menstrual health leave, something like that. Anyway, that also include perimenopause and menopause, but they are these are some of the things. They can create resentment from like male colleagues, for example, can say that it can also discourage people to employ women for that reason, because they need to add that if it was to be enforced. So, there are quite a few, and there's countries like, I think it's Japan. I really don't want to make this wrong, but because policies are, they do reflect the cultural systems and beliefs. They were established in the first place as a sort of like, again, protection of the woman who is seen as a hormone machine and has a reproductive machine, and is in a sort of like that discourse of like, menstruated women are very vulnerable and they need protections. They need to take some days off, which just encourages, again, stereotypes and assumptions on on women or menstruating bodies. So there are a few issues with that. And if in principle we can say it could be good having some sort of accommodations, but period leaves, there's not been actual evidence-based research that has proven their efficiency and their validity, if you know what I mean, and if it actually benefited those who are meant to protect.
Interesting. So how do these issues regarding menstruation in the workplace then also relate to breastfeeding women and how they are treated in industry?
So I'd say that in a sense they are quite similar, because we are again talking about bodily fluids, and that's something that makes just people uncomfortable. And actually doing this research, and I've been doing quite a lot of evidence review. So I've been reading quite a lot of literature, especially about menstrual health, and the fact that there's so much more about menopause than there is on menstruation just made me really think about how uncomfortable still people are with blood and fluids. So it's not that menopause doesn't have that sort of unpredictability,
but it's almost like it's stopping.
It just stops.
It's drying up.
Yeah, it's not anymore. And, the perimenopause is also an interesting moment, because there's a lot of unpredictability of, it could be mood, it could be the hot flushes, and it could be a lot of other conditions, even breakthrough bleeding, or I don't know if it's called breakthrough, but anyway, just a sudden bleeding and or heavy bleeding, and unpredictability of the period at that point. So that's another stage, and that's not talked about as much as menopause. And in terms of breastfeeding, then there's another body fluid that is milk, and that's another fluid that can appear in an unpredictable ways, and the leakiness and the messiness and the disruption from the normal and idealized body.
Leak. It's ugh. Even at home, it's not nice,
But it's what it is, and that's it's not great. Maybe I haven't experienced that myself, so I was pretty lucky that
You're very lucky. Yeah,
I exclusively breastfed my daughter, but it's just established in a way that I would produce exactly what she needed, so I never experienced that.
Okay.
Also, I took a year off for maternity leave, and it was also still in the kind of COVID / post lockdown period of time. So I wasn't really being at work. I didn't have to juggle breastfeeding and working. So that wasn't my experience, apart from when I went back to starting my PhD again, and I was straight to field work, and actually I had to breastfeed during my field work. But again, I was at home, back home in Sardinia, where I'm from, where I had my family around. I had places that I could.
I also feel like they're a bit more comfortable around it. That's been, at least my experience in Italy, I just felt like people were.
You reckon?
My experience. I can only base it off my experience, but I just felt like it was more family friendly. Family friendly, yeah.
Than the UK.
In some respects. I will say when I brought my son, so my son's a year and a half. I breastfed him until I was 11, or till he was 11, till I was 11. Good Lord. At 11 months. And then, but I just noticed, I didn't have to breastfeed him while we were there, but we did have to bring milk, and we had to bring a lot of supplies. And a good example, we went to a museum. We were in Florence, and I was with some friends of mine who don't have children, and they wouldn't even let them bring water in. This was the academia to see the David. And they said, sorry, you're going to have to leave your water there. We had an entire bag full of baby wipes, water, milk, bottles. And the security just went, come on through. It was like, they didn't even question it. They didn't even bother to put it through the security belt. They just said, just do what you need to do. Same when we were at the airport, they were just really great. And I thought that has been a very different experience than when I was in the States with my daughter, where they had us open up all the milk and then test it to see if there were drugs in it, which meant that all the milk spoiled on the flight. Like, we couldn't actually give it to her because anyway, it was a whole, basically we brought all this milk and then we had to throw it away. So I thought that was actually really nice for once, it was actually a benefit.
Yeah, that's really bad what we experienced there in the States. And I think in Italy and Sardinia, at least, I think there is I found this attitude of like welcoming a lot, like children and, being family friendly in their respect. They're all like children are a nice thing to have around. And there is that sort of like kind of care towards children and mothers in a certain way. Like, it happened to me that like they were checking just as I arrived at the airport, and we picked up our suitcase, and then before exiting there was just checking like random checks and stuff, and like as soon as they saw me with the baby, it's like, no, you just go, like, of course you need to go, you need to rest, you need a seat, and think that sort of care. But for example, on the breastfeeding side, I feel that here there is much more that pressure from like the NHS, for example, and from like the kind of international guidelines from the World Health Organization that recommends that mothers breastfeed until like 2.5, whatever. And I remember that like when I was back home and I was still breastfeeding my daughter, I breastfed her until she was 1.5 years. Although obviously she weaned at 6 months, so she was eating all sorts.
My son, he decided, he was just like, no, one day he's just like, I'm not interested anymore. So it was his choice.
Basically what happened to us. And by that time, so by the time that I went on field work and that, like, it wasn't anymore survival for my daughter. It was more like comfort and this and that, which still was needed at that point. And then it was a few months later, then we stopped very naturally. But I remember like people back home, it's like, you're still breastfeeding? It's like, it's like, still, when do you stop? When are you going to stop? It's like, she's walking, she's doing it, because there's still that mentality that's like, you don't.
I could see that in the States for sure. Definitely.
Whereas here there is more like this, I found anyway. But because I didn't have to experience it, I didn't experience it myself. I cannot talk for myself, and definitely I would need more data on this. But I do think, and from the literature, you can see that it is a disruption of the body, and it is something that is disruptive in the workplace. And even if there are accommodation where you get your child to come in and breastfeed them, whatever, there are some like places where you can go and breastfeed. It's still something that is not normalized as such, and it does. It does relate to, women's or other bodies of not being controlled and being so mutable. Is that a word? Changeable.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, in some respects, it's almost like, one is expected to control themselves if they're still breastfeeding their kid beyond a certain age. It's like, why can't you put a stop in that? With my daughter, there's a lot of, it's like anything. You have your first kid, there's things you think, okay, I wish I had done that differently. And there's definitely stuff I did differently with my son. And I'm so glad I did that, but I had to learn, right?
Yeah.
And with my daughter, I breastfed her until she was about 9 months, but I was also pumping and I hated it. And I was so miserable. And in the end, my mom was like, you need to stop because this is just making you unhappy. Yeah. And with my son, I didn't pump at all. And then I was happy. And then I looked forward to and then the whole process was different. But, I breastfed him until he was ready. Whereas before with my daughter, I made the decision. I don't know if it was the right decision, but I just decided. And I don't know. But then again, anything before a year, I don't think people would have necessarily batted an eyelid. But I do think being in the UK, there is that pressure to like go as long as possible, right? Because it's the best for the baby. I'm epileptic. So like from my perspective, I'm going to do what's best for me. And I'm going to do what's best for my medical condition. But I noticed, even if we talk about like the birthing process, there is a huge amount of pressure for women to give birth naturally in the UK, which blew my mind. I was like, no way in hell am I going without drugs. But it was almost like, well, you're almost like a bad person if you decide to use drugs. Whereas in the States, it's assumed you would want drugs and you have to specifically ask not to have drugs, by which point everybody would look like you're crazy. Like, why would you deliberately want that? But here, the UK, there's this sort of, I noticed, pressure to go without drugs. And if you want to really, adopt the full welcome ceremony into motherhood, you need to, experience this extreme amount of pain. And again, it was only because of my epilepsy on both occasions that I got moved up the queue in terms of being able to have access to this, to basically medication, so that I didn't have to go through the whole process. But it's only because of my health condition. And that's just so strange to me. If I hadn't had epilepsy, I might have been expected to just go whole hog no. And against my will, and around, in my mind, that's against my will. That's against what I feel comfortable with.
Yeah. I've got a completely opposite experience from this, meaning that I feel that, I don't know, again, probably my experience is also very biased, or, is very much affected by the fact that I was pregnant and gave birth during lockdown, basically. So access to information was a bit odd, a bit different than usual. And obviously the NHS was overburdened by other concerns arose by the pandemic. But I was very much, I really got like my own information. We did the NCT groups, and they're usually like, they tell you, like the kind of pros and cons of every sort of scenario. And you might, I don't know if you would feel pressured, but like, I don't know, in my NCT group, for example, we were all quite, I think we were all feeling very free of doing whatever. I think that to book an elective, what they call an elective C-section, then you will need to kind of have some sort of justification.
That makes sense. Yeah. That definitely.
Yeah. But otherwise, I'm not sure. But I really wanted to go through like kind of the natural process, and I wanted the least intervention I could get. And I like, as soon as, because I had my daughter was late, very late. And I was just keeping her because I felt that everything was going okay, that it was fine. But I felt the pressure of like rushing up things and medicalizing the situation, whereas I didn't really want it. And the experience I had was like that. It was a bit scary. Like the things that were telling me to convince me to rush things were very scary. And then it all went well. Like I had planned a whole like water birth with midwives.
Oh yeah, birth plans don't exist. They don't.
No, it didn't go as planned, but I could manage eventually to do it closest to what I wanted, in a sense. Although I felt much pressure of like doing other things, like take this, take that. I'm like, no, thanks. And my husband was informed, and like the information. I think that the issue really arises when there's not information accessible to you and you cannot make your own choices, you know? And you feel like you are, and I know that you cannot be an expert of everything, but the access to information that you need should be guaranteed at all times. And that's where I think you really can be empowered of making decisions for yourself, you know, because we had completely different experiences, like completely opposite. And I think that there is like what is like allowed and like the kind of information that you are given. You were given the information that you should be given birth naturally somehow. And I was given the information like, oh no, you should actually take this and take that. Whereas I didn't want to. And I didn't like, I had to sign things. Some things I didn't.
I had to sign things as well in order to get the epidural.
Yeah. Exactly. So that's interesting. But again, and it's like, because in a sense, there is this kind of discourse and this assumptions that like women have to go through pain, and they don't necessarily, if they don't want to, they don't want to. They
I mean, don't get me wrong. It was still painful. Like, it's not like I just like slept through the whole thing, but it was less painful than if I hadn't have been on it.
Yeah, and it's just so subjective, and that's again like this probably links nicely to what I think that policies and interventions should be like. It should be adaptable. So whenever, like, if you add, for example, a period leave again, and you leave it like it needs to be applicable to different circumstances, because this experiences that are subjective, and there are so many, like, as many bodies that are out there, as many different needs that are, and policies, guidelines, whatever there is, accommodations should be adaptable and should be flexible, you know, should not be set in stone in one way, because there's never going to be one way that fits all.
That's interesting. That is interesting, because that's something that my both my mom and my husband had mentioned this in varying ways, and it wasn't to be rude. It was just more like a thought, just like as we were talking about this topic. And they said, what role should the employer play, if at all, in your private life? Like, why does that need to be their concern or their problem or their issue? And again, this wasn't meant to be derogatory, but it's a general question. Where, because it's a blurred line. If you're going through cancer treatment, for example, and you don't really want anybody to know, but you also feel like you need to tell somebody because you're going to be going through a lot. It's a dance, right? So if you're going through something, whatever that is, in this case, we're talking about, gynecological health conditions, breastfeeding, whatever that may be, what role does the employer play in all of that?
If you think about it, work is a major aspect of our life. Even like it takes so much of your time in your life that it becomes private. I don't think it will be detached from your private life, because it's so pervasive. And it shouldn't be. And hopefully we're going to get to the direction of like work a bit less and live a bit more, But the way it is, I think there's just so much overlap that there is some sort of like responsibility that the employer and this should have, if not at an individual level, definitely at a structural level. So systemically and structurally, things need to be more accessible. And when I say more accessible, I mean that, and this is really backed up by research and evidence, that a lot of accommodation are really are not very costly and they benefit all, you know? So having a workplace, and I mean the structure and the system that is flexible in very sense of the term, then it will definitely have benefits for all. And it doesn't need to be tailored. It can be actually adaptable and it can benefit all, because as I said before, you know, like the ideal worker, who can we actually place in the ideal worker, you know, like a body, you know, or circumstances, or, you know, you mentioned cancer that can just kick in anytime, unfortunately, you know, and can just change your life. And then having a workplace that already accommodates preemptively, is that a word? Like, but you don't have to ask for it, but the workplace is already established and already organized to accommodate you. Then I think that's really where we want to go to. But it is interesting that you're asking that, because one thing that we're really seeing a lack of is accountability, is really a framework, like a framework for accountability in relation to EDI. And
what's EDI? Could you?
Equality, diversity, and inclusion.
Okay.
And yeah, it's like, who is accountable? Because there are guidelines, there are policies. Now we've got this amazing, really nice British standard that came out just at the end of March on menstrual health and perimenopause in the workplace, with a lot of like really good, nice, practical even guidelines and suggestions and points. But this is like, it's not mandatory, and it's like you can pick it or not. And therefore, it's like there are not systems in place that really evaluates accountability and who should be accountable. And it's like, is it on the onus of the marginalized people to educate, to put in place accommodation, or who is responsible? There's really no clear guidelines. So that's where we are trying to fill in. We're trying to fill in that gap of like really understand and clarify accountability.
That's a really good point. You know, there were other questions that I gave you that if we had time, I would definitely dive into it. But I think what I'm going to do is just ask to sort of round this out. If you were to give any advice to potential employees that are concerned about issues regarding menstrual health, breastfeeding, maternity issues in the workplace, how would you advise them in terms of preparing themselves, or how to address those problems in their particular work environment?
Educate themselves, listen to the lived experiences of people, and be open to change your own practices and assumptions. And then I think that's a good start already.
And also, we'll have plenty of information on our website for additional reading material if you're in that situation yourself, absolutely, and you would like to learn a little bit more. But I have to say, that's it from us for now at Coffee and Cocktails with your host, Dr. Ann Wand. I'd like to thank Chiara again for joining us at the studio this afternoon. Additional information on today's topic will be available on our website in the show notes. And if you enjoyed the show, then consider becoming a patron starting at £1 per month. It's support from our patrons that really helps to keep the show going. By becoming a patron, you get access to extra bonus content, patron-only interviews, panels, workshops, and much more. To join, just head over to patreon.com/coffee and cocktails podcast. Otherwise, that's it for now. Thanks for listening and have a great week.